After the students finished their mid-chapter tests, I had them get started on our next topic, which is going to be graphing an absolute value function. Now, this is a new idea, but what we're going to let you do and want you to do is kind of explore this, discover this a bit on your own. And so anytime you're introduced to a new graph, you want to make a table of values. So that's the first thing that you're going to do, make a table of values. Notice that you're plugging into the absolute value function. After you make that table of values, you want to graph that table of values. And then you're going to see something. You're actually going to see quite a few things that are kind of neat and special. And that's what you want to do to get started. So, how did you do? When it comes to making your table of values, again, you're plugging into the absolute value function. So it's going to be like the absolute value of -6. Well, that's just the distance from 0, which of course is 6. The absolute value of -4. Again, that's just the distance, so that's 4. And as we continue here, we can be sure to have these particular outputs. Now, when you graph these outputs, you get a special graph, but you want to graph them carefully. Here's -6, 6, that the first one in the table. -4, 4. -2, 2, and 0, 0. So again, you're just graphing them. Now remember, ultimately you're going to connect the dots. You're going to connect the dots with a line, but in the case of this problem, your line is kind of special, isn't it? Because your line, if it's only going to pass through these points, is going to create this kind of shape. Now, what is this kind of shape? Well, it's called an absolute value graph. And so we make some observations, some descriptions of what this is. Again, this is the absolute value graph. And the absolute value graph is always going to be a V shape. Do you see that? That's because we only have positive y values. That's kind of special, positive y values. And then lastly, you're going to learn that this point right here is pretty special. It's kind of like in the middle, and we call that the vertex. The vertex of this graph is at 0, 0. So those are all things to just kind of notice that, of course, we got because of this absolute value equation that gave us this table of values that turned into this graph. Now we notice some things about it. Now, keep in mind when it comes to the domain and range that we're thinking about with the graph, what values are on the graph. It keeps opening to the left and right. It keeps opening to the left and right forever. So we have -infinity to infinity. But notice that the whole graph is above this line. It's above this line. And this line, of course, is y = 0. So y = 0 is kind of like our starting value, but it goes up, up, and away to infinity. Now, that absolute value graph is what we're going to do is we're going to discover some things about it. The main thing we're going to discover is how we can start to change it, how we can change it various ways, and we call those transformations. Again, a transformation is a change. It's a change on a graph, and this is some new territory for us, but whenever we transform an equation, it's always going to involve some adding, subtracting, and or multiplying. And so if you take the absolute value equation and you multiply it by a, now we have a times the absolute value of x. If you add or subtract to h, you can say x, the absolute value of x plus or minus h. So now we're adding or subtracting on the inside. And lastly, you can add or subtract on the outside. Now, what is this that I just made? Well, this is like the transformation formula. And now the whole point of this activity is for you guys to kind of discover what happens. What happens if you add or subtract to h? What happens if you add or subtract at the end of the equation? And what happens if you multiply? Well, you're going to discover this by using the Desmos links, following the pages on Desmos. Now, the whole idea here is after you do the pages on Desmos, it's going to have you reflect, and eventually you can then write that reflection in this box as a rule. In fact, you're then going to write the next reflection. You're going to go through and you're going to reflect after each activity. Eventually, you'll be able to fill in these boxes. Okay, but you have to use the Desmos link. Now you want to switch to Desmos, and then as you finish each section, you'll be able to reflect on the back.